What's up, everybody? Corey Hughes Bloody History, and we're back talking about ZR rifle, right? Again, underneath William Colby, who's being interrogated by the church committee. They're trying to get to the bottom of who was aware when of the assassination programs, allegedly. So let me continue. Chairman Church says, now, when do your records show that Helms became aware of Harvey's whole assignment? Talking about Bill Harvey, as given to him by Bissell. Talking about ZR rifle and the Cuban issue. Mr. Breckenridge says, I don't have the accurate date. We have the 16th of August, 1963 memorandum. I promised Mr. Schwartz that I would try to find the date, and I was out of town yesterday and simply didn't do it. But I have to go through the record to find the earliest date that we have, and I simply have to go into the record to dig this out. Senator Schweiker says, do your records show the date of when the actual latest assassination attempt was finished? For Castro? Yes. When was the time frame, roughly? You're talking about the mafia connection. No, I'm talking about when did we finally cease and desist in attempting to assassinate Castro from your records? Breckenridge says, let me, if I may, and I don't mean to confuse the issue. The mafia connection from beginning to end was an attempt to assassinate Castro. The operation was called off finally in the spring, perhaps February of 1963. What year? 1963. That's the mafia part. Yes, sir, the Cubella Association has a different origin. Chairman Churchton says, first, who called off the mafia operation? As near as I could tell, it was Harvey. Church says, Harvey. Breckenridge says, Harvey. Harvey decided that it couldn't succeed. Harvey was leaving the country for a foreign assignment, and in conversation with Roselli, Roselli was the man who was in the mafia, through whom the agency had continued to work, and Roselli agreed that nothing has happened, nothing could happen, and it should be called off. We don't have a record that Harvey went anywhere for approval. This doesn't mean that he may not have discussed it, but I don't have the record of it. So Harvey, in his conversation with Roselli, terminated the operation. Senator Hart of Colorado says, the memo which we saw at the last session, which I don't know we officially have, Mr. Colby, made it available to us, was a wrap-up of the whole thing or a memo to the file. I can't recall now who did it. Schwartzen says, that is the one referring to the meeting with Robert Kennedy that we spent some time looking at. Senator Hart of Colorado, that was the Sheffield Edwards memo, which say with the collapse of the Bay of Pigs invasion operation, no further attempt was made with the mafia. It tied it directly to the Bay of Pigs. Mr. Colby, that was the first phase. There was a second phase that followed with the mafia. Chairman Church, we now know from what you have said that Harvey called off the mafia connection, and we don't know whether that was done with the knowledge or authority of anyone more high placed in the CIA. Breckenridge says, I don't know. All right, after Harvey left the country, who was then assigned to undertake the subsequent efforts again, the life of Castro? Breckenridge says, this brings us to Senator Schweiker's question. A man by the name of Orlando Cubella, who had been met in Mexico City by the agency in 1961, who had been one of the leaders of the anti-Batista groups and held the rank of major in the Cuban army. That's the highest rank they have. Cubella was an MD and had been a youth leader and attended youth conferences around the world, and was met first in Mexico City, and later he was met in Scandinavia on several occasions. And the conversations during these various meetings had to do with Cubella's desire to have a change in Cuba, and the attempt on the agency people who met with him to explore his ability to substitute a government, as well as be able to overthrow the existing government. These conversations were very general, exploratory, and non-productive. In one of the early meetings with Cubella, he talked about eliminating Castro, and the agency employee used the word assassination, which was reported back as being an offensive word to Cubella, and instructions were issued that Cubella was not to be given a mission of elimination of Castro or anyone else. He was met in October of 1963, at which time he made the proposal that he wished to have weapons which were to commit an assassination, and this proposal was rejected. He continued to speak in these terms, and finally, I cannot give you the level of approval that might be at the level of Mr. Fitzgerald, and I don't recall which job Mr. Fitzgerald had then, whether he headed the Cuban task force or whether he had become. Mr. Nosh then says, he replaced Harvey. Schwartz says, he did meet with this man and gave him a weapon or a poisoned pen with which to kill Castro. Breckenridge says Fitzgerald did not give him the pen. Schwartz asks, but discussed the subject? I was considering the question of level of authorization, and I don't recall. This is Breckenridge. I would assume Mr. Fitzgerald was the highest level of authorization that I know of. Chairman Church says, and Fitzgerald's position was at that time? I was questioning whether he had 3 jobs in fairly quick succession, whether he replaced Harvey as head of the Cuban task force. Then he became chief of, I can't read that, the Western Hemisphere Division, and then he became, for a short time, the deputy director of plans, but he died of a heart attack. I don't know whether he had, at that time, it would be in October of 63. Colby then says, I think at that time he was either head of the Cuban force or chief of the Western Hemisphere Division. Church asks, will you get that for the record? Yes, sir. Breckenridge states, the decision was taken to try and give Cubella some instrument. A ballpoint pen was designed that could be used as a syringe. Because Cubella was a doctor, the pen was given to him in Paris on the 22nd of November, 1963, with the suggestion that he use it. By whom was the pen given? It was given by a case officer of the agency. In fact, Cubella refused to take it. When we wrote our report, we thought he accepted it, but I've since learned that he refused it. He said it was not practical. Because he was a doctor, it was suggested that he could acquire the material to put in the pen, but he refused to accept it. Conversations continued, and finally the agency arranged to put down 2 caches at sea off the coast of Cuba, one of which had weapons in it, one of which had just general equipment. Senator Schweiker, could either of those involve the story that appeared in the press under Colonel Prouty's statement? No, sir. Schweiker says, did that come later, Colonel Prouty? Breckenridge says, we still don't know what Colonel Prouty's statements refer to. Nosh says, Prouty's allegations go back to 1959. What? 59, late 59 and early 60. Breckenridge says, we can arrange to have a Cuban refugee, or we arranged to have a Cuban refugee leader meet Cubella in Spain, at which time he gave him an additional weapon. That would have been in February of 64, I think. If you notice, he just changed the conversation entirely. They're trying to get to the bottom of Colonel Fletcher Prouty's allegations that he made going back to 59 or 60, which are probably having to do with assassination because they're not clarifying here. And then Breckenridge is like, what? No, 1964. These fucking guys. Every single one of you who's listened to this podcast for a while should be absolute experts at counterinterrogation. Chairman Church, what kind of weapon was given to him? It's to my recollection it was a rifle. I'm not sure of that. Cubella continued to have conversations and meetings from time to time as he came out of Cuba, and finally in the middle of 65, the decision was taken to cut off contact with him because there were serious questions about the security of his organization. He was arrested, I think. I have gotten my dates right, is subject to correction. He was arrested in the early part of 66 and tried, made a confession, had a public trial, which was reported in the press. I wonder if I might check those dates. Chairman Church, surely. While you check those dates, perhaps Mr. Colby could explain how it was during this period that Cubella was able to return to Cuba and travel through Europe. I assume he was able to return to Cuba? Colby says he was a Cuban officer at the time and apparently loyal to Castro. He would go out on various trips and things like that, and we would meet him there. Schwartz says he was the man who met Mr. Hunt in Madrid. He met with a friend of Mr. Hunt. A Cuban exile met Cubella in Madrid. That is when weapons were handed over. Was Mr. Hunt in Madrid at the time? Who else was in Madrid, people? Come on, think. Mr. Colby, yes. Breckenridge, no, because this man by the name of Artimo met Cubella in Madrid in December of 64, and in February of 65 he made the delivery of weapons. Hunt was not assigned there until the middle of 1965 after this was over. We don't know where that story came from. Colby says Hunt and Artimo are very close, and he is the godfather of one of their children, and things like that. He may have told him about it. Chairman Church said during this period you have described, when these various contacts were made with Cubella, who was the highest officer within the CIA who had knowledge of these contacts and who authorized them to be made as far as your investigation shows? I don't know the level at which the contacts were known. I would assume that the continuing contacts were known at a high level, but I have to assume that, and this goes to a point when Senator Schweiker was asking the question at the last time, this is the last instance that we know of in which assassination was involved. Senator Schweiker said, that is, both your records and your interviews indicate that this was the last known activity according to your investigation. That was specifically related to Castro. And the date was when? Well, our contact with the Cubella group was broken off in June of 65. June of when? 1965. I don't want to confuse you, but I would like to introduce a consideration that relates to this. Chairman Church, before you do that, I have to ask what your investigation shows is the highest officer who knew and under whose authority these continuing contacts were made, and you said you assumed it must have been known to higher authority. Breckenridge then said, I said that about the contacts. I assume this was known fairly high in the agency. Church says the contacts and their purpose. This is a distinction I want to make. The people who are involved in this is difficult, but their statement of state of mind and your interpretation may be different things. But the people who were involved considered that the purpose of the association with Cubella was he was a man who was high in the Castro government. He was a man who represented a dissatisfied element. He had people who agreed with him. The hope that was this could be developed into a group in Cuba that in some way could replace the government. The conversations with Cubella were really not productive, and Cubella wanted some demonstration of support, tangible support, and the conversations progressed to the point that he wanted equipment with which he could commit an assassination. In the minds of the people who dealt with him, the question of assassination was not uppermost. It's so much as to give him a material demonstration of support. I don't mean to be trite, but the United States or the agency has in the past provided weapons of one kind or another to people paramilitarily. In the minds of these people, however credible to you this distinction is drawn, so assassination became a consideration, but assassination had not been the objective. I'm sorry, one more point. Something is cut off and says something began to provide weapons to him should have required higher level approval. I don't know what level of approval was. Schwartz says it should have under the normal procedures. Yes, sir. Church says at one point a meeting took place and an agent of the CIA gave him a ballpoint pen that had been specially designed to camouflage a syringe and gave it to him with the recommendation that it would be filled with poison and used to kill Castro. Are you saying that the agency may have done this without the knowledge of the director or deputy director of plans or someone high in the agency? No, I'm saying there should have been authorization. I don't know the level of that authorization. I merely tried to draw a distinction because it is a question raised in my mind. It was raised by Senator Schweiker's question, when was the last attempt of assassination? This developed to the point where assassination was involved, and this was the last such interest that we know of. Are you saying after the incident that Senator Church just asked you about it, the point of emphasis shifted from assassinating him to replacing him? Is that what you're trying to tell us, or did I misconstrue that too? So Schweiker's getting frustrated, as he should be. Breckenridge says, no, I'm confusing the issue by trying to describe the state of mind of the people who were involved in the operation. Yeah, you're doing it on purpose, you dumb fuck. Church says, we don't even know who were involved. You tell us that. As far as I know, Mr. Fitzgerald would be the highest level that I know of was aware of this. What was his position? We're back to that. He was chief of the Western Hemisphere Division. It looks like he got the rest of the page redacted. Senator Morgan, is he dead? Colby, yes, sir. Breckenridge, the problem that you're having, which is one that we have, is reconstructing certain aspects of this, quite frankly, and we have attempted to reconstruct it by the record, where the record supports it by interviews, where the interviews can fill gaps. And it was of some interest to try to get from the people involved their rationale. The rationale is difficult, complex, and I have tried to convey that because it was brought to my mind by Senator Schweiker's question. Colby says, if I could help interpret this from a cultural pattern, I think the point is that we located this major. He looked like a very promising contact within Cuba who could possibly replace. See, what he's doing is he's jumping in to bring the conversation back to a place where they want it to be. In the course of the conversation, the 1963 meeting with the ballpoint pen took place. We don't have any clear record as to who authorized that particular aspect of the relationship concerning the ballpoint pen. The fact that we then went on with him until 64 and 65 with the officers of weapons fits into the general support of that effort and doesn't necessarily coincide with the deliberate attempts to assassinate him, although it could, and our records don't clearly indicate one way or the other on that. Church says the cache of weapons delivered on the coast of Cuba hardly constitutes an arsenal by which its reasons could be assumed that the government can be overthrown. It does, however, fit into a scheme of providing the major and his cohorts with a capability of assassinating the Cuban leader. Colby says it also coincides with the possibility of the first step towards additional arms. I'm not denying it, Mr. Chairman. I'm saying that the records don't clearly indicate it, and this gets back to Mr. Schwartz's original question to me. Can you define assassination? I would respectfully request that I don't get into that because there is a question as to when you're supporting armed action and when you're committing an assassination. Church says, all right, during this whole period, we understand that the director of the CIA, who was Mr. McCone, had said he had no knowledge of these ongoing activities. Colby says, I would imagine that his testimony that he did not know of an assassination would be consistent with my comment as to the weapons being given in support of armed action, but not the specific assassination plans. I don't know that, but I'm saying that is possible explanation of the differences between those stories. You see, this is what they do all the time. They inject something that is designed to split the conversation, right? So that they're trying to get to point A, but you just split the conversation so there's an A and a B. You're focusing on B while no one gives a fuck about B, right? That's a pattern that I'm determining in this CIA deflection of fucking questions, right? And they're obviously taught this internally, right? This is something that the United States government pays the CIA money, and then CIA uses that money to train their agents to hide shit from the U.S. government. Like, go fuck yourself. Church says, we will have to question Mr. McCone much more closely on that point. But you're unable to tell us in connection with these later activities whether or not there was specific knowledge of their connection with the assassination purpose above the level of Fitzgerald. At this moment, I cannot. May I pursue a line of question for just a few minutes? First of all, Mr. Schwartz, this document, Exhibit A, who prepared it? This is the original rough draft that was prepared only by the typists. Schwartz says, that is the Ken Greer document, Greer. Mr. Colby says, prepared by one of Mr. Breckenridge's associates, Mr. Kenneth Greer. Senator Morgan says, what was the purpose of the preparation of this document? Colby, it followed the 9th of May, 1973 directive by Mr. Schlesinger for a report on all questionable activities. These were gathered together by Mr. Greer and other members of the Inspector General's office, and a summary of them was provided to me to use to brief the chairman of the two committees. Senator Morgan, this was the best information that the agency was able to obtain at the time. Colby says that was the information available to the Inspector General at the time. I think I would say that it was, and then it cuts off. I don't think we instituted an aggressive, positive investigation. We rather collected what we had available. Morgan says, well, there have been assassination attempts or efforts on the part of the government. There is no question in my mind. The question I want to pursue is that in the document marked here, Exhibit A, Project ZR Rifle, it stated that early in the Kennedy administration, the White House urged Richard Bissell to create an executive action capability. That is a general standby capability to carry out assassinations. Now, that was the primary purpose of ZR Rifle. Is that your understanding? It was one of the purposes of the ZR Rifle project, said Mr. Colby. Morgan says, and it was done at the instigation of the White House, in quotes. Colby says, we have one record which states that Mr. Bissell made this statement without further precision. Senator Morgan, and where's Mr. Bissell? Colby says, Mr. Bissell, I think, lives in Connecticut now. Jim, see if you can find any interviews with Mr. Bissell. Senator Morgan says, now later on, we find that this project continued on under a man by the name of Bill Harvey. Did it not? Yes, sir. And then on June 27, 1973, he wrote a memorandum to the chief FI staff. What does FI mean? Colby says, Foreign Intelligence Staff. Morgan says, stating that the original justification for employing QJ Wynn no longer existed and raised the question of his termination. 63, was it? Senator Morgan says, June of 63. He was terminated in April of 64. Colby says, yes. Morgan, now there is no doubt in your mind but what this project was known by the director of the CIA. Colby says, approved by the director. I don't think we can say for sure. Morgan says, Mr. Colby, isn't it a reasonable assumption that if a project of this magnitude was to carry out the assassination, it would not be created without the approval of the director of the CIA? Colby says, it better not be created without my approval now, I will guarantee you. Morgan says, it certainly is not reasonable to assume that even in 61, it would have been so created. Colby says, I would think that's the general idea. Whether the specific project or not, but the general idea is so significant, and that is the indication that Mr. Dulles did know of this act at the time. Whether it was specifically brought to the attention of his successor, I could not actually testify one way or the other. Morgan says, Mr. Colby, can you make any more sensitive a project at the CIA than one of assassination? Colby says, when Mr. Schlesinger came in, I made sure he was aware of anything I knew. Senator Morgan, and this being true, aren't you satisfied in your own mind that all your directors were aware of this Project ZR rifle until such a time as it was terminated? That is a conclusion, Senator. I can't give testimony on that. Senator Morgan says, it is a conclusion, but you are an expert. Colby says, right. You're the director of the CIA, and you have had experience and knowledge in the history of the CIA. Let me ask you, based upon your history, the history and knowledge of the CIA that you know of, have as director, and you have gained as director, aren't you satisfied that every director knew of this project? Colby says, in the face of the statement by Mr. McCone that he did not know of it, I find that statement difficult to challenge. I agree with you, he should have known about it, but I could not say for sure that statement is not accurate. One final question. Mr. McCone left the agency when? In 65. Morgan says, I won't ask any other questions except for the record. I would like to say this so I can remember why I was pursuing this later on. I ask these questions not to try to show the assassination plan because I think that has already been established. And if that is all we are after here, we can move on to something else. But the thing that does concern me is that if this project continued on until and past the time of President Kennedy was assassinated, then it raises a question in my mind as to whether or not Castro himself may not have well known about it, and whether or not the president's assassination may not have been a part of a recrimination plan, and it may just open the door to whether or not later on we should decide to look into that. That is the reason I have followed that line of questions. Church says, Senator Hart. Senator Hart of Colorado, Mr. Colby, in connection with ZR Rifle, I think you testified on your associate said that this was a multi-purpose operation, including stealing codes and the development of the capability of what euphemistically is called executive action. In your professional judgment and with your history of your background in the agency, does it make sense that to you a major operation, a major intelligence gathering operation of the sort of stealing codes, which I assume means from other governments, would be mounted under the direction of a man about whom all I know is that Mr. Harvey has a background of something like a soldier of fortune and funded at the level, I should say, of $7,500 or $10,000? Does it not suggest to you that stealing codes was in fact an internal cover for what was explicitly an assassination operation with unlimited non-voucher financial capability? Bingo! Who fucking just asked that question? That's Senator Hart of Colorado. That is the most goddamn important question in this entire fucking charade that we're calling a testimony. All I know is that Mr. Harvey has a background of something like a soldier of fortune and funded at the level of, should I say, 7,500 or 10,000. Does it not suggest to you that stealing codes was in fact an internal cover for what was explicitly an assassination operation with unlimited non-voucher financial capability? Colby says, no, not that it was purely a cover. In the first place, Mr. Harvey had a very successful tour in Berlin, where he ran the Berlin Tunnel operation, which was one of our major successful intelligence operations. Mr. Harvey was a very colorful figure who had his lifestyle, which is different than some others, but he had been very effective at that and very adventuresome in that category of signals intelligence and a very adventuresome idea of that nature. He was something of the FI division staff. That staff's major function is to conduct the signals intelligence work, which must be done in the clandestine service. It handles our efforts today to penetrate into foreign code rooms abroad and things of that nature, and it involves the breaking into of safes and things, all that complicated material. Now, the thing that puts it together with this capability, executive action, is the high degree of compartmentation of this material. that kind of project. In other words, a code breaking, a stealing operation, obvious that it is to be kept very, very secret. If you get caught in it, it has all sorts of bad diplomatic implications and so forth. Therefore, there is a system of very sharp compartmentation of the work of that particular group. You're also dealing with some very adventuresome people who are willing to crawl into somebody else's code room and take the chance of getting caught. So given you have a man who had some good technical experience, who is adventuresome type himself and running a program which is not too far off the requirements of high compartmentation and a very high risk kind of operation, and therefore for Mr. Bissell to have selected Harvey to carry out this project seems to me that it's compatible, that he could be running code breaking projects or stealing projects as well as this other activity. Now, in the lifestyle at the time, not mentioning the second one, this gets back into the record keeping that we've been discussing. It was not to be put on the record, although to be done. That's a perfectly proper hypothesis, it seems to me. But to say that code stealing was only a cover, I think, is probably an unwarranted conclusion. Senator Hart of Colorado, what about the level of funding of $7,500 to $10,000? Colby says, that is not very much money for that kind of an operation. Precisely, I think it's too little, says Senator Hart. Colby says, no, for a capability of that nature, it's largely a staff operation. In other words, you use your own staff officers. You may hire an agent or something, but I don't think you can draw much conclusion from the actual number on the figure one way or the other. So you see what Colby's doing here. He's just running cover for the agency. That's what this whole fucking interview is. It seems like Church and Schweiker and some of these guys want to get to the bottom of it, but they're not going to let them. And I hate to say this, but when you read through Colby's testimony, it's so bland. It almost makes the CIA seem like a fucking administrative operation, right? Like they're not really doing anything except, we work in an office, blah, blah, blah. But no, they are the devil. Colby says, I find it hard to say that this is the only amount of money involved. I think you get in situations where additional money would be put into either of these kind of activities. I wouldn't get hung up on the bureaucratic aspect of the number of dollars. Senator Hart of Colorado says, so Mr. Harvey, if the decision were made to try to liquidate a foreign leader, and Mr. Harvey found the instrumentality, the individual to do that, and required $100,000, all he had to do was come back in and say, Mr. Colby, he could get it. Schwartzen says, I think we should have the record reflect two things. The two gentlemen talking are not eyewitnesses to what we have been talking about. Second, and related to that, for us to pursue this matter, we must have right way the better evidence, which is in the possession of the CIA, which is at least the Inspector General report of 1967. And more importantly than that, the interview notes reflecting whatever interviews you had with whomever you interviewed at that time or later. Colby says these we will make available to you for the extent we have them. Breckenridge, we retained no notes. We kept only the one report that we submitted to Mr. Helms at the time, the one copy. When he left the agency, he returned it to us. Now the files on the Cubella affair and the Trujillo affair exist, and they are available. Schwartz says, can we have it understood that Mr. Breckenridge, you will, as you did with the initial material, come down sometime early next week, and so we can go over it and so forth? Sure, if we can just have the same sort of normal ground rules about the papers. Sure, they always apply unless, Colby says, I know. Chairman Church says, unless we say differently. Schwartz says, no, just following up one more thing on Senator Hart's question of some time ago. Would you determine with respect to 5 different periods of time? First, was there any internal evaluation within the CIA as to whether or not the assassination attempts should continue? And second, whether there was any discussion with persons outside of the CIA as to whether or not the plot should continue? And the period of time would be the initial authorization, which was March of 1960, after the Bay of Pigs during the missile crisis. And parenthetically there, will you state whether it was possible Castro might have been assassinated pursuant to an ongoing plan during a period of time when the United States and Russia were close to nuclear confrontation? The next case is John F. Kennedy's assassination. Finally, at the time of the breakoff in June 65, which I believe was Mr. Breckenridge's testimony, was anybody in higher authority told that the operation had been broken off? Because whether anybody in higher authority had authorized or requested this operation. Colby says, yes, fine. Schwartz says, can I pick up then another subject which was just barely touched on last time, Mr. Colby? This is related to the question I asked you about the criminal elements. Senator Mathias chimes in, says, before we leave this, I have one question. In light of the fact this poisoned pen was actually proffered on the 22nd of November 1963, is there a scintilla of evidence and was proffered to a major in the Cuban army on active duty? Is there a scintilla of evidence that anyone in the Cuban government had any knowledge or suspicion prior to that date that this was a project that was planned? Colby says there is certainly no evidence that anyone had information with respect to the Cubella operation. The second phase of the mafia operation had been wrapped up by then, I think. The individual in Cuba involved had taken asylum, I believe. Breckenridge says, no, the sequence is a little different. Colby says a little later. Something were people who reportedly were sent into Cuba, a team of 3 people, and I said reported because they were working then through a Cuban exile leader. They had the assignment of recruiting additional people to carry out such plans as might be developed. We never knew what happened to those people, whether they came back, only that they were sent in. But if you're looking for possibility of knowledge of an assassination plot, conceivably, those 3 people could be the source of it, but not that the United States government was behind it. Senator Mathias, but it is conceivable that Castro and his government could have come up some evidence that there was a plot afoot. He certainly could have crossed allegations, and you really must assume that various other kinds of even independent activities or the first phase of the mafia program could have produced allegations of attempts against him with the comment that the CIA or United States was behind it. The possibility of that kind of allegation is just almost infinite, particularly considering the nature of the instruments that were being deployed. Yes, sir. Breckenridge says there's another consideration. You really haven't told us on the record until just now in response to Senator Mathias just what the second phase of the mafia connection for assassination Castro was. We really haven't had the detail except as you gave it to Senator Mathias. I wonder if you could complete the record on this second phase, give us all the information that you know about it. Breckenridge says, before I do, one additional consideration. The Cuban exile community in Miami was engaged in a great deal of plotting of its own and a great deal of hyperbole, and it is safe to assume that Castro also had reports of assassination schemes or threats from that group. So there is one more source to that sort of thing. Senator Schweiker says, where's Cubella now? Is he still in prison? Breckenridge says, in jail on the Isle of Pines. Morgan says, are we sure of what? I asked somebody the other day, and they said that it was is where they think he is. I just wondered whose agent he really was. Colby says he's been in jail for a long time, if he was Castro's. Senator Morgan says, you testified he was able to go in and out of Cuba fairly frequently. He was an associate of Castro's, there's no question about that, but he had an independent relation with us that finally got picked up. I think that's important, Mr. Chairman, that we try to keep his name out of any published documents for that reason. There's no use in getting him in more trouble. Schweiker says that is for sure. Chairman Church, there's no argument on that score. Would you please furnish us with all the details as to the second phase of the mafia connection? Breckenridge says, we will give you more accurate detail when we give you the report, but I will recite now the best that I can recall. Church says, before you do, would you explain exactly what the relationship between the CIA and Giancana and Mayu was, because that is not clear in my mind. Would you develop for the committee that whole relationship? Breckenridge says, Robert Mayu used to work for the FBI, and he resigned from the FBI and opened a private investigative firm here in Washington, and the CIA used him from time to time for certain kinds of support activities. What kind of support activities? On one occasion, he obtained a female companion for an important foreign leader. Church asks what other kind of support. Breckenridge says in the early days, and this becomes an embarrassment as nearly as I can reconstruct, the people who knew him decided to put him on a retainer in the Office of Security, which they did for a while until he was so successful he said he no longer needed the retainer, which he didn't do much to earn. He later got involved in representing one of the Greek shipping interests, and we were given the result of some of the information that he obtained from that, where there was a fight between Miarchos and Onassis. We think he may have had some involvement in another foreign leader's companionship when he was in this country. I don't have the details. I think we can probably reconstruct it for you. Chairman Church, can we have the file on him? Breckenridge says, I think we will provide that one. We have that one, yes. Very well. When Mayu left Washington and moved out west, I think first to Los Angeles, later to Las Vegas, where he became associated with the Hughes organization, and when the question about getting an introduction to the mafia, because they did have gambling interests in Cuba at that time. The Office of Security, Colonel Edwards, was asked if he could establish a contact, and he went to Mayu, or had someone go to Mayu, to see if Mayu could make such an introduction. Mayu knew a man by the name of Johnny Roselli, who lived in Los Angeles, who had the concession for the ice-making machines on the Strip in Las Vegas. And Roselli arranged an introduction to the CIA, actually arranged. Our man didn't meet Giancana, I don't believe, arranged an introduction, but Giancana, who in turn arranged an introduction to a man by the name of Santo Traficante. Traficante was the head of the Cuban gambling interests, and Castro had allowed them. First, he had closed them, then he had reopened them, hoping to attract tourists, and Traficante traveled to and from Cuba. Giancana served only as the introduction to Traficante. This was all done through Roselli. Our people they all dealt with Roselli, who in turn dealt with others. Roselli was in essence a cutout, or served as the middleman. Roselli was never paid for his services. Giancana clearly knew, eventually, the government association. Roselli came to know of it through, initially, he was introduced to the CIA person as a man who worked for Mayu on an assignment by a private client. So initially the cover story was Mayu's private client who had an interest inside of Cuba. Giancana never really was involved subsequently. He did arrange, it was from Traficante. It was Traficante from then on, and Traficante had sources inside Cuba who had an office and position in the office of the prime minister. He was believed to have access to Castro, and a poison pill was developed that he was to insert into Castro's food. The pills were sent to this man. What we did not know at the time was the man who had lost his job and lost his access, and the pills were returned. Colby said that is the first phase. Senator Schweiker, would you date that? Mr. Breckenridge, that would be the early part of 61, March, April 61. Schwartz, the pills were given as part of the first phase to a second person in Cuba. Is that correct? Breckenridge, just before the first phase ended, Roselli, through Traficante, was introduced to another Cuban exile leader in Miami by the name of Anthony Verona. Again, his name is a sensitive matter. Verona was the leader of one of the groups that was being supported by the CIA as part of the preparation for the Bay of Pigs. Verona was unhappy with this association, with the CIA. He felt he'd not been given enough money. Verona had previous contact with the criminal element in Cuba, and he was approached by Roselli with Traficante's introduction to take on this mission. Roselli's story was that he represented some private client who had an interest in Cuba. The Roselli identity was apparent, as was Traficante's. Verona said he knew someone who was in a restaurant that Castro frequented, and then the pills were transported again. Could you state for the record who made the pills? Mr. Breckenridge said the pills were made in what was then the Technical Services Division of the CIA. Schwartz, did they ever make such pills before? Breckenridge, not that I know of. Schwartz, had they ever used botulinum as a poison in any other ways before? One previous occasion, botulinum had been considered for use on cigars that someone had hoped to get to Castro, and eventually that never got off the ground. This was a scheme that was never approved and never went forward. I know of that one instance which it was considered. Botulinum was made into pills, and these pills were taken again to Cuba. Castro stopped going to the restaurant where this man was. The Bay of Pigs occurred at the operation was called off when Harvey took over and then reactivated the second phase in April of 1962. They went back to Verona, and one of the strange things is that Verona started off with the repetition of the original restaurant approach, which I think caused some question as to the gap between what we were told and what was happening. Verona, after this, didn't materialize. Verona then stated that he had sent 3 men into Cuba whose job was to recruit additional people for such a plan as may develop. He later planned to send in 3 more people. We don't believe they ever went. The missile crisis intervened. There were a number of delays, and we don't think they ever did go in. The first 3 men, if in fact they did go in, we don't know who they were. We don't know what they did. We don't know whether they came out or not. As a matter of interest, the man who was to go back something as soon as possible, they went in and could have been captured by Castro. Breckenridge says, it is possible. The question is that Senator Morgan asked earlier what they could have known. as these men we don't believe could have known the actual backers of the operation because Verona was dealing with a member of the syndicate with whom he had previous connections. The people who dealt with Verona felt that Roselli was discredited and careful, or was discreet and careful. But those men could have been captured. They could have supplied the interpretation that they might not have known. Nothing came of the operation. It was called off, but essentially that is the first and second phase. Chairman Church, these three men were to be sent from Breckenridge. They were Cuban exiles to be sent from the United States. Colby says from the U.S., yes. Chairman Church, then why is it you don't know whether or not they were sent? Breckenridge says, the question exists in my mind. I'm not sure it exists in other people's minds. As I reviewed the record when we got the record back in preparation for these inquiries, I was struck by the fact that Verona had told us at the very end of the first phase that he was using this restaurant, and when a year later the phase was reactivated, the same story was used and already had been proven not to be so. Later, he talked in general terms about the three men, and I began to develop some reservation in my mind as to whether or not Verona had in fact told us the truth. That is purely speculation on my part. Colby says, this is a problem we live with in the intelligence business. When you're not able to be in direct contact for good reason, you're subject to fabrication, particularly if there is some money involved. Chairman Church, did the CIA in connection with Phase 1 or Phase 2 pay any of these agents for their services? In Phase 1, I think we paid expense money. Phase 2, we gave money to Verona. And to Roselli? Breckenridge says, we paid expense money for Roselli. Schwartz says, you paid him money to buy guns. Breckenridge says, I was going to tell the gun story. Verona wanted money and guns and some of the equipment that he specified could only be obtained from the U.S. military. And the equipment that was acquired at the time did not include that kind of equipment. It included equipment that could be obtained from other sources and excluded U.S. military equipment. It was provided through the assistance of the Miami station. A U-Haul truck was picked up and delivered, I know. Mr. Breckenridge, the first man who had the job in the office of the Prime Minister, this man did get kickbacks from the criminals. I think that must be the one you remember. He took refuge in the Venezuelan embassy and stayed there until 1964. He finally was given safe conduct to pass out. The Mexican embassy took over from Venezuela. Cuba broke diplomatic relations. He continued to be a political refugee in that embassy until the fall of 1964. What was Verona's motive for participating in the plot? Verona was one of the exile leaders who wanted to overthrow Castro. He wanted more financing than he had. He would cooperate with anyone. He would like to pick up the discussion. I would like to pick up the discussion we had. Chairman Church, Mr. Schwartz has 5 minutes more and we will conclude. And I would like to ask the committee to stay for 10 more minutes for an executive session. Schwartz says, in the discussion we had on the use of criminal elements, we have dealt with the Castro operation. In the middle of the book supplied to us by Mr. Breckenridge earlier this week, there's a discussion about Lumumba operation and the agent Q.J. Wynn. Now, is it a fact that Q.J. Wynn was the agent or asset, however you would refer to him, who apparently was considered for the effort to assassinate Lumumba, which never took place? Is that right? Yes, sir. Now, is it accurate that Q.J. Wynn operated in Europe trying to spot and assess individuals whom the agency could use in safe-cracking operations? Colby says, this is what is reported, and it is quite possible. Breckenridge, the record indicates that Schwartz, and this is further so that one of the CIA officers who first met with Q.J. Wynn in Luxembourg was on a trip overseas to find safecrackers and document suppliers. Colby, yes, that is what it says. As a matter of historical record, is the OSS the predecessor of the CIA in some sense? Colby, yes, it is. Schwartz, is it correct that Lucky Luciano was used to help the OSS in connection with operations in Italy during the Second World War? Colby says, I don't know, but I have heard that story as well. It is an extensive story, but I don't know the facts. Schwartz says, for the record, Mr. Luciano was a mafia figure who had been deported from the United States or was in jail in the United States. He was in jail, I guess, and was later deported after the war. Schwartz, now in connection with the instructions which you issued in 1973 concerning activities outside the character of the CIA, or outside the charter of the CIA, you received, as we went through the other day, a report from the Inspector General leading up to that in May of 1973. Colby, that is right. Schwartz, and was part of the report that the CIA had itself conducted for local police departments in Washington, Arlington, Fairfax, and Alexandria. During the period 1968 and 1969, a series of classes in items which included basics in surveillance, photography, basic audio, and counter sabotage. And in addition, this is what I particularly called your attention to looks and pics and I can't read the rest. Yes, sir. Schwartz says, I'm now reading from page 225 and 226 of the 694 pages that we can't fucking find. I appreciate Jim going out and looking for these 694 fucking pages that we can't locate because they're fucking probably FOIA. We need to FOIA these 694 pages. That is a goddamn fact. Maybe, Jim, you should get with Tony and maybe you guys can figure it out. Mr. Schwartz, is the fact that, for example, between October 7th and October 1868, the CIA conducted a course for the Washington Police Department in the subject of surreptitious entry. Colby, it was included in that, yes. Schwartz, what was the purpose of conducting such a course? Colby, we had a relationship with various police departments around the country. They, from time to time, would like to learn our knowledge of certain subjects that are quite unique to the CIA. There are a number of things that we have to do in the CIA, which are quite frankly outside the norm of most other agencies of the government. Chairman Church, doesn't surreptitious entry refer to illegal entry? Colby, going in secretly, that's what it means. Entering secretly in some fashion or another, yes. Chairman Church, that is an illegal activity for local police, is it not? Colby, presumably yes. Chairman Church, why is CIA conducting courses teaching local police illegal activity on how to conduct illegal operations? Colby, I think at the time, Mr. Chairman, that was at the request of the police department of that area, that they were interested in this thing and there is a defensive element of it. In order to know how to protect against something, it is well known how it is actually conducted. Chairman Church, do you construe that this activity to be within the law, the basic statute which restricts your domestic activities? Colby, I don't think it's a violation of the law, Mr. Chairman. I did give it some directive on that in 1973, that we were not engaging in this anymore in compliance with the spirit of the amendment of the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration Act, which says the CIA will not provide support to the LEAA in its assistance to local police departments. And as far as I was concerned, that is a policy that they don't want CIA in touch with local police departments. The fact of sharing our knowledge of techniques with a local police department does not, in my mind, get us into actually conducting domestic police activity. There is a difference there. Chairman Church, apart from the technical question of your jurisdiction when you engage in teaching local police departments how to conduct break-ins, surreptitious break-ins, you're teaching them how to break the law. Colby, you're teaching them how the law is broken. Chairman Church, that is right. Colby, which can be useful to them in their knowledge of how the law is broken, the techniques that are feasible. Chairman Church, or can be useful to them in knowing how to break the law. It could. It is an item of information that they can use in any way they wish, either properly or improperly. Schwartz asks, are you aware of any situations where governmental officials, either state, local, or federal, have in fact engaged in break-ins within the United States? Colby, I know of certain situations related to foreign intelligence operations where access to appropriate targets has been obtained either through subterfuge of pretending to be a workman or something of that nature. And I think in that history, there are some cases of actual break-ins. Now, I assure you, Mr. Chairman, we have been conducting break-ins abroad. There is no question about that. That is, we train our people to be able to do that. Chairman Church, that is not the question I'm raising with you. In other words, these courses, it is my impression, were general discussions of techniques. They were not particular hand-holding on conducting a specific operation. I think I am accurate in that statement. Mr. Smothers then says, Mr. Colby, just a couple of quick questions. First, with regard to the files, memoranda, or diaries you might have of former directors, are those still on agency premises? Do you have those matters still there that were left by former directors? Colby, certain ones we do. I don't know of any that we don't have. As far as I'm concerned, they are agency property, and when I leave, I'm going to walk out without any paper. Mr. Smothers, with respect to the inquiries you have made with regard to information in the files on assassinations, have these inquiries extended to an examination of these files of former directors? In one or two instances on specific points, we have made inquiries. We have not gone through the files in general for that purpose. Colby, we have gone through that collection. I know of Mr. Helm's files. I don't know of any specific set of files called Mr. McCone's files. There is an executive registry where my correspondence is kept, for example. Mr. Smothers, what am I searching for? What I'm searching for in this situation where the generic classification of materials might somehow have not been complete enough for us to get particular knowledge. And I was wondering prior to our next meeting if a search oriented with respect to the issue of knowledge might be a fruitful exercise. Colby, knowledge by previous directors of specifics on this topic? Yes. I think it's easy for Mr. Helms. I think we've gone through his files. I don't know of any separate set of files on Mr. Dulles or Mr. McCone. We will look. Senator Mondale, there was a reference to John McCone's files in one of the memos that I looked at this morning. I will check that, Senator. That's a good point, and I'm glad you have raised it, says Mr. Church. I think we will conclude the hearing at this point with the understanding, Mr. Colby, we'll be back in touch with you. Surely, many times, I think, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Church says, yes. I think the next week we'll not have any formal meetings of the committee owing to the recess, but we will then, I think we are going to have to go into tri-weekly meetings beginning after the recess so we can step up the pace for the investigation. If they could get the Lansdale memo. Colby, I will do that this afternoon. I would like to add two things that have come to my attention on the subject of assassinations, both of which are allegations, both of which have been knocked down. There was an allegation some man alleged that he was working or conducting an assassination in Colombia, and we have looked into the specifics of it, and there is absolutely nothing to it. I thought I would mention it. I have facts here, and we'll include them at some time. There's another allegation that one of our officers had some knowledge of an attempt against Chow and Lai, and he has written me a note that points out that this is impossible for that to have happened because he wasn't in that place at that time. Chairman Church, since they are allegations into which you have inquired, I think you should make the papers available. I will make sure the staff gets those. Chairman Church, thank you very much. And then Mr. Noche says, could I point out, I think we have the answer to the photographs. There were 7 of these photographs taken at different angles at the same time, but absolutely different time intervals during the time that the police had these men in custody. Talking about the 3 tramps again. Mr. Noshton says, I am not certain that the particular board that you were looking at. With the blow-ups, they could have had this one of the 7 photographs, which gives the best opportunity to look at the face. Mr. Colby then says, so they were separate photographs. Chairman Church says, yes. Mr. Notch says, I'll be glad to leave that with you if you would like to have it for your file. And thereby the committee calls it quits at 12:30 p.m., and that's the end of the document. So this, for some reason, wasn't released until June of 2022. This is a fairly new document from the 2022 document dumps. Very good information in here. Remember, understanding Kennedy is about understanding the landscape of what was going on in the CIA and the FBI and the government and all of history in Cuba and fucking Mexico and Chile, right? And the Dominican Republic and Haiti. These are all very important, relevant topics. And so when we go over documents like this, what we're doing is we're really getting we're filling in some more crocheting of the background of the tapestry, right? That's exactly what this is. And so coming to understand Roland Cubella, his operation, all that stuff is of excellent and great importance, right? So this document had some really good nuggets in it. But now that we've done this, I'm going to go back to a couple of days of Jack Ruby. We're going to go back to Jack Ruby tomorrow, Friday, and all of next week. So I hope you've enjoyed this little excursion, and I will see y'all next week. Please tune in to bloodyhistory.substack.com. Doing some good things over there. So